Thanks so much for having us here at the RoleSimpósio of Role-Playing Games, LARP, and Education. My name is Jessica Hammer. I'm the director of the Center for Transformational Play at Carnegie Mellon University, where we make and study games that change how people think, feel, and behave. And I'm here today with Moyra Turkington. Over to you, Mo.
Hi, I'm Mo Turkington. I am the creator of the Warbird series of games about women fighting on the front line of history. And I run a design studio and publisher called Unruly Designs. And I'm part of the Center for Transformational Play as a design fellow.
We are here today to talk to you about designing challenging history game. And I thought that we might just start by talking about what do we mean by challenging history games, right? What's challenging history? And for that, I'm going to turn over to Mo.
So for challenging, to find out what challenging history is, we can also talk about what challenging histories are. So challenging histories are often difficult and uncomfortable. They are invigorating or relooking at histories that are hard to look at or experience in general, or that might be either strongly narrativized or obscured. So either one single story is told about them or no stories are told at all. And that histories that have, when we're talking about going from challenging histories to games, we are talking about games that also are histories that also have the capacity for injury. But when we talk about challenging history in this respect, we're talking about looking back into a period of time where we have, when we're specifically talking about Rosenstrasse and our experience of things, we're talking about how there is a single strong narrative that has happened that has kind of been retold over and over and over and over again from a victor's point of view. And so Jess and I are very fond of quoting Walter Benjamin, who talked about brushing history against the grain. So if you can imagine history as a swath of velvet where all the things flow in one direction, if you slide your hand back against the grain of that velvet, you'll see a very different picture in front of you. And so Benjamin advocated that we look at narratives of history from different perspectives, and we look at different evidences of history, and we challenge the notion that we should always be reiterating the story of the victor.
That's something I love about working with Mo, right? Is this double entendre, this double take on what challenging history means. That it's both looking at periods in history that can be difficult to confront, especially if you have a personal connection to them, if it's part of your family history, but also challenging what we think of as history. Mm-hmm. And today we're going to talk about this through the lens of a game that we made together, one of my favorite collaborations, called Rosenstrasse, which, let's be clear, is challenging on both fronts. And I thought we would just start by talking about what is Rosenstrasse. So as a game, it's an analog role-playing game. It's a pleasure speaking to this audience because I don't have to explain to you what an analog role-playing game is. It is live in-person play for 2 to 4 players plus a facilitator. You can actually see me there in that picture. I'm facilitating. You can tell because I'm holding the facilitator book that helps you run the game. And we also have other kinds of physical play materials like cards and props that help you sort of stay focused on the experience of playing the game and that walk you through this historical period. And the choice to design a highly supported game with, for example, specific scene prompts on cards, right? Not letting the players decide what the scene is going to be, is actually one of the important strategies we use to deal with challenging history, as you'll see later in this talk. Mo, do you want to tell us a little bit about the history of that we're addressing with Rosenstrasse?
Yeah, so Rosenstrasse is focusing on the slow erosion of civil liberties in the period in Berlin between 1933 and 1943. And we are specifically focused in on intermarried relationships. So relationships between a man who the state has considered Jewish and a woman who the state has considered Aryan, or vice versa. But basically, people who are interfaith marriages, and we are looking at them through this, at their loss of liberties through this period of time. We see moments of their lives through the story, and we see how little by little the state changes the definition of who they are, what they're allowed to do, where they're allowed to go, how they're allowed to be free, and even sometimes even if they're allowed to stay together or be together. And of course, then we culminate the game in what is the history culminates itself in a historic women's protest, which is basically when these men in these relationships were rounded up as the last known Jews of Berlin were rounded up and put into the Rosenstrasse facility, Rosenstrasse being on Rose Street, obviously, and they were being scheduled for deportation. And the women, the wives and daughters in their lives, showed up and protested. And they were unorganized, unsupported, unfounded. They stood up against the Reich and demanded that their husbands be returned to them. And so the game follows this arc and aims to tell the story through the lens of the characters inside of it.
So in tackling Rosenstrasse, we were tackling a very difficult design problem. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum actually explicitly recommends that people not use games or simulations to teach Holocaust history. And they have very good reasons for doing this. So in the past, people have tried to engage this history through games, and the research shows that there are some unpleasant things that can happen. So for example, one educational attempt, the learners walked away feeling like, I really know what it's like to be a Jew in the Holocaust, right? That's maybe not an ideal learning outcome. Other times you would see the learners sort of laughing and joking their way through these very serious experiences. So, past experience just shows that it's really tricky to do this in a way that is both engaging, respectful, and effective. But Mo and I had this idea that we could use our skills to take a stab at this problem in a way that nobody had really tried before, that might address these underlying challenges and that actually maybe other people could use to work with not just the Holocaust, but other sorts of challenging history that needs challenging. And in particular, right, Mo is a history powerhouse. She keeps every time I work with her, she brings me amazing historical tidbits and insights and a vision of what history should feel like, right? That it's not just about the facts that you know, but it's about the way you're narrativizing and shaping the history. One of the things that I brought to the table is my background in educational research, that I've actually got a PhD in learning science, and it turns out that was really useful in making some of the key decisions for what we were going to do and how we were going to create this game. And then finally, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but one of the things that made it work was just doing lots and lots of play testing and making sure that we weren't just relying on our own perspectives, but that we were actually engaging the perspectives of the many different stakeholders in this story. So if you want to know more about what we learned, we actually put together a paper called Designing Role-Playing Games That Address the Holocaust. You can get it for free on the internet. It is in the International Journal of, well, I've forgotten the name, but if you, of what?
International Journal of Design and Play, I think. Yes.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Well, if you search for the title, you will find it. And but what we want to do today is give you a little preview. If you don't want to go and read, a whole paper on this, of some of the things that we learned through this experience. And what we did is we actually identified 4 categories of design challenges. And the reason why we thought about these as categories is because we actually are not claiming that we've discovered every design challenge that exists, right? There were a bunch of design challenges that were particularly salient for us. Those are the ones we put in the paper, but we thought these categories would be useful to other people thinking about the same problem. So challenges of how do you engage history in the game when players may either not know much about the history or may have strong preconceptions about it that don't align with what the game is supposed to do. Number 2, who should you be? How can you be them? How do you engage with a character who may be very different from yourself in a respectful way when they're in a difficult historical situation? Challenges of agency, right? One thing about history is it's in the past. So how do you give people the agency that they expect during play while still staying true to the story that you are telling about the historical experience? And then finally, what should the game feel like, right? Should people be laughing and joking during the game? Spoilers, we're going to come back to that later. So we actually invite those of you who work on historical games, help us add to these challenges. But the 8 challenges that we explore in the paper are here. Just going to give you a minute to look at them. And we're going to talk about 4 of them today. The interests of time and being able to actually talk deeply about each of these things, please do go to the paper if you're interested in the others. So the first one we're going to talk about is lack of context. I'm going to turn over to Mo.
So lack of context is a little bit about what I was talking about earlier, which is we all think we have a concept of history that is, but that history is incomplete. The more it's told, the less we know about it, especially the less we know about it as told by people who are not the dominant people we tend to tell stories about. In Concerns of Rosenstrasse, for example, there's a lot that happened between 1933 and 1943. And one of the first things that we wanted to come up against, or one of the first goals of the game from a teaching perspective, was specifically to have a look at how things did not happen overnight, that they happened in a very long, slow process. And so how do you teach that process to players, and how do you get them to integrate it? There's a lot of information you have to get into their heads and also have them look at it new. So one of the ways we approach this is that we had characters primarily ensconced in playing relationships rather than other games which might have you playing kind of active agents of the state or active agents of a resistance. We put these into the lives of regular everyday people. And we asked people not to know the history beforehand, but to give them history just in time, scene by scene, based on events, and ask them to draw on their experience as people engaged in relationships in their lives. It's a universal human component. We know how to do that. So we would give a set of characters, always operating in a pair, usually a husband and wife pair, a scene. And that scene would say, you are 2 people. There's two characters in the game that are involved in the publishing industry, a translator and a publisher, and they are confronted with a scene about the book burning that happened, in the very famous one that happened in Berlin, where one of the characters has already been at it and seen it, and it has happened in like the moment before, and the scene is actually situated in the space of those 2 people talking about what has just happened, what it means to them, coping with the emotionality with it, and talking about what it means to their future and what challenges they might have to move forward with. And so we have this situation where, rather than drawing on what we know about the Holocaust or what we know about Germany and the Third Reich, or what we know about what Hollywood has chosen us, we're giving a personal lens to recope with new information and giving that new information just in time. The other thing that we did was it was very important to us to make sure that we didn't reiterate this feeling that this one single story of things. So we wanted to make sure that a lot of Hollywood movies, a lot of narratives that we tell about World War II talk about how, we make the Nazis this great big evil, and they are the people, and the people and soldiers and Hitler and all of those. But we don't talk about the roles of the everyday people and citizens in Berlin that participated actively in the tragedies that occurred. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't putting our players into the roles of the heroes of the story, where they would walk away saying, I was good, I did this thing, it was easy. We wanted to make sure all those things were taken care of. And so one of the ways that we approach this in the game is we had complicity cards. So basically, we have these scenes that are the couples sharing things with each other, but then we disrupt those narratives. We disrupt the experience of being in the game by these complicity cards. So once per game, every player at the table must do this action, in which the cards are handed, 2 cards are handed to them. They are asked to read them, choose one, and inflict it on another player at the table. And usually they are targeting another couple pair. So both outcomes on those cards are, both scenes on those cards or actions on those cards are the everyday people of Berlin, and they are things that are happening that are undesirable to one of the two people at the table in the couple. And the choices are always difficult. And so what happens is the player who has been going through sitting inside from the lens of the kind of protagonist of the story all of a sudden has to step out and see how everyday and embody the space of everyday people making decisions that are going to harm or put in jeopardy the characters that they're just starting to really get to know and love. So those complicity cards were a particularly interesting way for us to kind of challenge and disrupt the narratives and always make sure that players at the table were actively learning and engaged with the information they were coming to.
Well, and I'll say, oh boy, did they engage, right? These complicity cards would come up and they might have to choose, for example, between a character being reported to the Reich by a neighbor or their partner facing an attempt at sexual exploitation, right? And they look at these cards and they go, oh no, right? So there's a really personal reaction of like, I don't want to do this. And the game forces them to do it anyways, right? They have to sit with that discomfort of you're choosing one of these things and you don't get to get out of it, right? That this is embedded in a social context and you need to see what it feels like to be the person who is enforcing the social context as well as the person who is being victimized by it. So I've always found those to be really powerful moments when we've play tested and when we've seen the game run. All right, so next, we're going to talk about one-dimensionality. And again, I'm going to turn back over to Mo for this one.
Yeah, so the big thing here is we talk about the story of the Jewish experience in the Holocaust as a victim narrative, a single one-dimensional victim narrative. And we don't, when we develop victim narratives that are universalized like that, we don't see the individual people within them, and we start to lose empathy for them. And we also start to lose the truth of history and a lot of the things that we need to remember about very difficult and challenging periods in history. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was we built a very mindfully constructed character population of the game. So I've already talked about how they're all set up in dyads, so that there were three different husband-wife pairs, and there was also a brother and sister pair that were in their own intermarriages. But those characters, as a set, our story, the first thing about that is that the story is not just then one story, it is an eightfold story, right? So there are 8 perspectives sitting at the table, and they are all seeing the world of Berlin in this decade through the lens of their character, and that those characters are set up very interdimensionally. So there is characters that are male and female, obviously, and in each player at the table will play a male character and a female character, so that both sides of the events that will later happen at Rosenstrasse will be experienced by them, and so that they both feel a male and a female experience that is happening in that slow erosion, and so that they both feel the gender pressures on our characters. There are those that are married and those that are not, those that are Jewish and those that are Aryan. There are folks that are vulnerable economically and very wealthy. There are folks that are successful and set up and have there's a different or a wide variety of Judaism sitting at the table. There's folks who are very spiritual and religious, and there are folks that are very intellectual and thinky about their religion, and there are folks who are just determined by the state to be Jewish when they don't consider themselves to be Jewish at all. So we created this eightfold model in what Jess taught me from the from the actual academic theory of things, are contrasting cases, right? So this is something that I kind of lean to intuitively as a designer and just put words to it, which I'll always be happy about, that these contrasting cases and embodying these contrasting cases at once, both as a single player and then also watching the other 6 cases sitting at the table, you are challenging everything you know about that single narrative. Every predisposition you had to think thinking you understood is challenged by a perspective that sits and happens at the table. And you get to watch from 1933 and experience, sorry, from 1933 to 1943, how those erosions of civil liberties hit different people at the table differently. They mean different things to different people. Some people feel safe and some people do not. Some people have access to remedies and some people do not. And so you were constantly challenging and brushing that history against the grain and kind of reflooding your understanding of that period of time. And it makes you reevaluate the entire situation far more deeply than otherwise, than if you were playing through the lens of one character.
Part of making sure that you're really engaging the characters as humans rather than as a mass or a category has to do with this idea of blaming the victim, right? And there's a sort of extreme position of blaming the victim where there are people who are usually pretty close to Holocaust deniers who will say, well, yes, the Holocaust happened, but really the Jews deserved it. It was their fault. They are, in fact, all of the things that the Nazis said they were. But for most people you encounter, blaming the victim works in a much more subtle way, where they will say, why didn't the Jews just? And that word just is doing an enormous amount of work there. It implies that there was an alternative that individual Jews could have taken that was obvious, simple, and feasible. And in fact, for most Jews, they did not have a lot of choices. And again, this gets back to pushing against stereotype. So for example, we know one stereotype of Jews is that Jews are very wealthy, right? Not factually correct. So part of what we do here is, well, why didn't the Jews just spend money to leave the country? Well, we have a couple that's designed specifically to address that just. So this is a young romantic couple. He's a musician. She's a florist. They're deeply in love and they're very poor, right? He has a large family, can't get help from his family. Her family is not in Berlin. She has no sort of resources. And they have an opportunity where he could get money from a Jewish organization to leave the country, but they will not fund her to leave. And they don't have the money themselves to go. So they have to choose whether to stay together and they, there's no just there, right? Would you leave someone you love in danger? Or would you get out? That's not an obvious choice. So what we're trying to do here is to take those things where you might feel this is obvious, this is what you should do, and make you see that there is not an obvious answer. Anything you want to add before we go on, Mo?
No, it did perfect.
All right. So then the last thing I mentioned, we were going to come back to this thing about laughing your way through a game about serious history, which is there's this idea that it's inappropriate for people to have playful or lighthearted experiences during a game that deals with serious topics, to which I say if it's good enough for Shakespeare, it's good enough for us. So when Shakespeare writes a tragedy, right, within that tragedy, there are moments that are lighthearted and funny, and those moments are actually used to heighten the tragedy and the despair, because giving people moments of pleasure makes them feel like they have something to lose. So we're actually filming this during Passover, and one of my favorite scenes in the game that is a more sort of playful or lighthearted scene is early on. There's a brother-sister pair who are very family-oriented and very engaged in Jewish life, and they're having a joint Seder, right, a ritual meal with both of their families. And there's a part of the Seder where the kids get to ask for prizes, right? For those who've heard of it, this is related to the ritual of the Afikomen. And the scene is about the kids asking for stuff and the adults, the characters, right, deciding what are we gonna give our children? What promises do we want to make to them? And the facilitator is encouraged to make the kids, cute and funny, and to give you a place to laugh and be happy. All the while you are doing it in the shadow of doom, knowing that this is happening in Berlin in the early 30s, and that whatever promises you make to your child, you cannot count on fulfilling them. You do not know if you will be able to protect them. And so putting these moments of play or joy or fun deeply into the context of the tragedy, I think also humanizes these characters, right? These are not characters who are just miserable all the time. Even in the worst moments, there are places where you can find love and care and connection. And that is part of what makes us human, that we don't just have one emotional valence all the time. Big piece of this is that it actually is written in the game book that you should never require anyone to play Rosenstrasse. And I think that that's part of where some of the inappropriate play or inappropriate pleasure comes from. That when people feel like they have to engage this history and they're not ready, or they're not sort of able to take it to face it, that they respond by using distancing techniques, like being silly, like laughing, like making fun of the history. So we provide channels within the game for this kind of like fun and play and pleasure in ways that heighten the emotional experience. But we also want to make sure that if people aren't willing to have that challenged, right, to have their playful side channeled into these specific moments that serve a design purpose in the game, that they just don't play at all. And that's critical to, I think, treating this kind of history respectfully. And there are lots of other ways that there are lots of other historical games you can play, lots of other ways that you can learn about Holocaust history. The only people who should be playing Rosenstrasse are those who are prepared for the experience and willing to take it seriously, which also means having fun.
I'd add one thing, which is going through all the playtests that we did, you can actually see this in your players. So this game can be played as a tabletop or a LARP. And so obviously when people are LARPing, they're more physically embodied generally. But even when you're just playing this as a tabletop game, those moments of levity break the feel of the game. So it's like if you keep something compressed the entire course of the game, it can either explode or you go numb, right? Those are the two options for total tension all the time. But you can see this rise and fall of energy, really, and engagement at the table for this moment of relief will carry you over into the next thing. And as a game that is centered on the relationships of people, that's how we as people do it for each other too, right? We get the engagement from each other, find our joy where we can make it, and find our resilience where we have it.
That's right. So we're coming to the end of our talk, and just want to talk a little bit about how you might use this work. So we are pretty clear that the challenges that we identified are not specific to Rosenstrasse and not specific to Holocaust history, but are actually common to difficult history, right? That you're always going to have to worry about telling a one-dimensional story, for example, and that's always a challenge you're going to have to address. But the way that they manifest in a given moment of history varies. So, for example, when you're telling a story about Jews, you need to understand the myth of Jewish hyperpower, that Jews are wealthy and powerful and capable of anything, right? That is not true for other groups that you might be telling stories about. So you really need to understand the specifics of your historical moment and of the groups that may have been flattened, where you're trying to brush that nap, right? Brush that velvet back up against the grain. So what this means is that your design solutions are going to be different from ours, right? We've talked about some of the strategies we used. You may choose to use some of them. For example, contrasting cases is a great technique to apply in role-playing games when there are multiple players and multiple characters at the table. But the way that you put these things into practice will be your own, and you are strongly encouraged to do that. But if you're going to do that, the most important thing that you can do is play test. I think we play tested Rosenstrasse with about 250 players before we released.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was making sure that we were play testing with different audiences who would come to the game with different prior knowledge and prior experience. So we actually play tested both with the descendants of Holocaust survivors and with the descendants of Holocaust perpetrators. We play tested with people who had extensive Holocaust knowledge, including Holocaust educators, and we played with people who had a background where what they were taught in school was Holocaust denial, right? We played with people who had a lot of experience with role-playing games and people who were first-time role players. And we knew that the game needed to work for all of these different audiences if we wanted to reach, because you don't know who you're going to have at your table, right? And so I think one of the all right, Mo made many brilliant decisions, but this is one of my favorite brilliant decisions in our design work together, was Mo said we should just start out with people telling about their relationship to the Holocaust at the beginning of the game. And one of our core design principles for the game is that you take care of the people at the table, right? We are people first and players second. And that helps you know who's vulnerable, right? Where you may need to, if you're a facilitator, where you may need to step in and protect or take care of your players. If you're a player, it helps you know maybe there are toes that you shouldn't step on, right? And it also helps create this understanding that after the game, we found people just want to talk about their experience, less so with us and more so with each other.
Yeah.
And so having that understanding of each other as people is really important for facilitating those post-game conversations.
And one note to that is that calibration happens before the kind of, there's no final consent because the game mandates that you check for consent along the way to continue playing, but also to see if people are okay and make sure they have questions to answer. But specifically, Rosenstrass does the calibration of who we are, shows us who we're going to play, and before actually, and through those workshopping periods, gets us really calibrated with each other and the expectations of the game, and then asks you, are you wanting to proceed, and are you committing to working to support the other people at the table? I think that's a super important thing too, because it sets up this view of, it sets up your responsibilities as a player, but it also makes sure that people know that they will be uncomfortable during the course of the game, but will stick with each other. And I feel like we hit a really nice note there.
I'll add that I think, I came into this going, we're going to make a role-playing game that non-role players can play and run. And it turned out that actually also was really important for the kind of calibration work that Mo is talking about. That if you remember that picture you saw of me earlier, I'm holding a book that's like this thick. That's because, in theory, you can just go through the book, follow the instructions, and successfully play the game. You don't have to come to it with a ton of prior knowledge about either the Holocaust or role-playing games. It turns out that there's an additional benefit of that, which is that it reduces what's called cognitive load. If you've ever tried to fill out an Excel spreadsheet while juggling and being on the phone, if you can imagine that, that's high cognitive load, right? Your brain is just like trying to process really hard, and you don't have a lot of attention to spare for other things. So by lowering the cognitive load, by just read the instructions on this page of the book and then follow them, you don't have to think about what's going to happen 3 or 4 scenes ahead. Just trust the process. That we gave the facilitator much more room to pay attention to how players are feeling and to be able to either draw them out, right? So we provide suggestions on, like, if players are having a hard time, here's something you can say to prompt them, but also to stop the game if they need to either deal with someone who is having a difficult time emotionally, or to say, hey, it sounds like there's a big misconception about the Holocaust here. We have some of those marked in the book. Let's just take a second and address it. Now we'll go back to play.
Yep.
And so I think that makes the facilitators far more effective at doing that critically important thing that Mo brought up.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. We, again, you can take a look at our paper if you want to hear more, and we're always really excited to talk about the work that we've done on Rosen Strasse, but also on thinking about historical role-playing more broadly. Looking forward to continued conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. And you can find the game if you're looking for it at unrulydesigns.com.
Bom, gente, sinto informar que as autoras não estão, né? Vocês vão ter que se contentar comigo e com o Fábio, né? Que já lemos o jogo e etc. E já comentamos, né, Fábio,
Sim.
sobre o jogo.
Eu acho maravilhoso essa abordagem delas, assim, e como é relevante para várias situações, assim, né? Eu acho que é transcender a ideia do Holocausto, mas pensar em diversas situações em que a gente pode pensar na construção de uma experiência em sala de aula ou numa experiência de jogo que aborde temas sensíveis e importantes de serem tratados com sua devida relevância, assim, né? Às vezes a gente está tratando, sei lá, da chegada dos portugueses aqui no Brasil como uma anedota, assim, né? E a gente precisa levar isso com a seriedade e com os impactos que isso causou, assim, né? Eu acho fenomenal, assim, ter a coragem que a Jéssica e a Moyra tiveram, assim, e como elas conseguem trazer de uma maneira super válida, assim, né? Para que a gente possa refletir sobre esses momentos, assim, né? E usando o poder do jogo, né? Porque eu acho que é essencial isso, assim. O jogo é muito mais potente do que só uma exposição, assim, do que né? Falar sobre aquilo, né?
Eu vou compartilhar o vídeo que eu fiz sobre esse artigo delas, tá? Acabei de compartilhar com o link. Depois, se alguém quiser ver. Queria fazer alguns comentários, então, sobre, né? Eu participei do financiamento coletivo, então eu tenho, né? O PDF só, eu não, o dólar é caro, né? O dólar é caro e aí quando eles vendem uma caixa, né, não é todo jogo que a gente consegue comprar e etc. Mas basicamente o que a gente tem o jogo ele traz muitas discussões. Eu acho que assim, e o artigo delas também traz uma discussão muito importante, que elas falam, olha, é, esse jogo é um jogo que vai ser desagradável, tá? Então, assim, é diferente, às vezes quando eu falo, eu quero jogar um Dungeons and Dragons, né, etc. E você vai conversar com, gente, o que que vocês não querem? Que a gente chama de sessão zero, né? Que é você conversar com os jogadores, o que que eles não gostam. Por exemplo, um jogador que fala, um jogador que, sei lá, tem aracnofobia. Então, fala, por favor, que não apareçam aranhas no jogo, porque eu não me sinto bem, não é agradável. Então, né, o narrador, né, a mesa vai evitar. Vai falar, esse jogo não tem isso, porque esse jogo é sobre o Holocausto e não dá para fazer uma história leve sobre o Holocausto. Né? Eu acho que esse é um primeiro ponto muito importante. Na minha palestra sobre RPG e Sociologia, e Larp, né, Sociologia e Larp, eu comentei sobre a questão, né, que você problematiza quando você centraliza o tema. Ele não aparece marginal. Ele não aparece como algo lateral à narrativa. Ele aparece como o elemento central que né, você vai ter essa imersão. Então não tem aqui uma possibilidade de tangenciar. O jogo te direciona para isso. Se você não quiser jogar, não jogue.
Eu acho legal também como elas preparam isso, então, né? Elas direcionam criando um caminho claro, né, para aquele evento, para aquela situação, definem como que é um personagem, como que é o outro. Então, em alguns aspectos, esse jogo que lida com esse tema não dá uma abertura, né, para fazer diferente, para pensar um modelo, uma característica diferente para aquilo. E se a gente inserisse uma outra coisa? Não, o jogo é desse jeito e vamos lidar com isso para a gente tratar dessa questão com e pensar nos impactos, né? Porque eu acho que isso é importante também, porque começa a criar, caso não que seja contra improvisação, não é isso, né? Mas quando a gente está pensando em situações tão delicadas, né? A gente vai criando cada vez mais coisas que ficam difíceis de lidar. A gente precisa estar um pouco mais preparado para isso, né? E o fato de a gente direcionar mais, a gente garante que sejam experiências que a gente já pensou e já consegue saber minimamente como lidar com isso, assim, né? É uma maneira de se sentir seguro para lidar com aquelas questões.
E tem um ponto muito importante que eu gostaria de reforçar, que elas dizem, primeiro, né? A gente está num simpósio RPG, Larp, Educação, as aulas daqui não foi feito para sala de aula. Isso não foi feito para escola, isso foi feito para museu, isso foi feito para, né, para atividades. A gente não está pensando em usar em escola. Então, por isso que esse jogo ele é tão pesado, tá? Ele é tão pesado porque ele trabalha, ele não pensa em jovens de 14, 15 anos, 18, não é um ambiente, vai falar, esse é um jogo pesado, né? É isso, a gente vai trabalhar com questões muito sérias, muito pesadas, e é muito interessante que elas procuraram sobreviventes né, o playtest. Eu queria aproveitar esse tempo que a gente tem 20 minutos, a gente nunca teve 20 minutos para falar, e a gente tem um dado muito importante aqui, se você quiser criar seu jogo. Eu queria até trazer para a tela uma conversa que aqui a Cristina Pirassol Serrano falou: pretendo fazer um RPG com meus alunos sobre o Diário de Anne Frank. Esse tema veio bem a calhar. Eu acho que esse é um ponto muito importante, que é pensar o seguinte: nem todos os nossos jogos eles dão certo a primeira vez. A gente faz o jogo, a gente testa e a gente vai perguntando. Né? Os meus jogos eu escrevo, eu testo, eu vejo o que me incomoda, eu vejo o que não funciona, eu revejo, eu reescrevo, né? Então, quando você tiver dificuldade, né? Poxa, eu tô com isso daqui, mas pô, não deu certo. Não desiste. Tenta focalizar o problema. Tenta falar assim, tá, o que que eu não gostei nisso? Pô, eu não gostei que, sei lá, do Diário de Anne Frank, né? A gente imaginar, ah, ficou fácil demais, ou ficou difícil demais. Enfim, eu tive, né, uma experiência junto com os coautores do Ubris, que é a gente ficar tentando discutir como que a gente aborda a política macro e micro. E foram anos de discussão. Não estou falando que vocês vão usar anos, né? Até porque é um jogo maior, etc. Mas a ideia de que testa, aí vê outros jogos, joga outros jogos, tenta copiar uma mecânica de um para o outro, adapta. Não tenha vergonha. Não tenha vergonha. Você gostaria de comentar alguma coisa sobre?
O que eu vi, assim, eu acho que é que tu mesmo falou em outro momento isso que eu acho que é bem válido, sim, né? Que o jogo nunca é mais importante do que as pessoas que estão ali, do que né? E, e eu acho que em algum momento, se for necessário mesmo, né? Assim, tentou, viu que deu errado, muda o cenário, avisa o pessoal que não, não tá ficando, tá ficando uma situação ruim, né?
Uhum.
Evita de dar continuidade a uma prática que está causando principalmente o sofrimento a alguém, assim, né? Principalmente o desconforto ali que não a gente não está preparado a lidar, não tá. Então, Eu acho super válido e aí refletir sobre, né, o que aconteceu, o que eu posso fazer para que essa situação seja resolvida de uma outra forma, para que o jogo possa ter um desempenho melhor, né? Acho que é nesse sentido. Assim.
Bom, vamos para outra. Você
Eu separei
deixe-me.
algumas questões ali, se tu quiser
Pode.
ver.
Bom, vamos então aqui passar um. Nossa,
Uhum.
na RoleSimpósio só trouxe gente grande para o evento. Mas grandes somos todos nós, né? Quem está aqui, quem gravou, vocês estão aqui, porque, de novo, é coletivo, né? É um trabalho coletivo que a gente faz conjunto. Ele só é grande porque estamos todos dialogando. Bom, sobre, né,
As
sobre a
perguntas do Alessio.
experiência né, de randomizar, né, os casais. Se vocês quiserem, eu posso mandar essa pergunta para as autoras, tá? Eu mando por e-mail para elas. E aí depois eu posso colocar a resposta no WhatsApp do RoleSimpósio, tá? E eu compartilho as respostas delas, tá? Porque aí eu acho que, né, vai direto para elas na questão do jogo. Eu acho que nada melhor do que as próprias autoras, né? Então, falando aqui como que eles reagiram,
É,
eu posso mandar para elas.
eu,
Pode
eu,
falar.
eu, eu diria que assim, ele perguntou de parceiros do mesmo gênero, né? Eu acho que isso
Uhum.
merecia um jogo específico, assim, pra gente lidar com o que surge na sociedade sobre esse tema, né? A gente precisa abordar de maneira séria também, não dá para fazer
Uhum,
de
uhum.
jeito leviano, assim, achar que é só é uma pequena mudança, porque a gente sabe aonde a gente está, né?
É. E, né, a questão do aspecto das consequências os problemas consequentes da guerra, né?
Uhum.
Bom, aqui a gente tem um comentário da Maria, né? Mas é interessante que um dos desafios é evitar que a sensação de empatia leve o participante a se julgar detentor da experiência de ser judeu nessa época e lugar. Gente, as autoras foram convidadas exatamente por causa desse texto, que é um texto fantástico, que eu coloquei o link, né, do vídeo que eu gravei comentando, onde elas levantam os problemas. E quando elas falam sobre o simular o Holocausto, existe um problema muito sério tá, dentro da memória do Holocausto sobre como abordar o Holocausto. É um ponto muito sensível, né? A gente tem artigos falando, olha, não pode usar RPG, porque e basicamente elas debatem esses pontos. Elas falam, olha, tem esse fato aqui de que o cara pode se sentir mais inteligente. Eu consegui escapar, era só fazer isso, né? Então elas vão respondendo cada um dos problemas com as suas escolhas de design, né? E aí a gente estende exatamente para isso, para a gente poder falar, pô, e a escravidão atlântica, né? Do africano no Brasil, nas Américas, ele entra nesse ponto também, é muito sério, né? Fábio?
O ensino médio, a Crislene fala, né? Crislene Ferreira, o ensino médio é carente de novas experiências. Geralmente só é cobrado deles estudar para um vestibular e pronto. Eu achei válido trazer essa questão para pensar assim. Eu acho que a gente precisa procurar inovar mesmo com o nosso ensino médio, né? A gente precisa estratégias que permitam que os alunos reflitam, se posicionem, tenham pensamento crítico sobre, né? E às vezes a rotina de estudos principalmente do final do ensino médio, assim, ela parece que faz com que essas coisas pareçam besteira, pareçam que não deveriam estar na escola, né? Assim, é um discurso muito presente nos próprios alunos, nos pais, muitas vezes na própria escola também, né? E eu acho que é super importante a gente pensar em diferentes estratégias para abordar assuntos na sala de aula, assim, assuntos que sejam mereçam reflexão de um jeito mais justo com eles, né?
Esse é um ponto muito sério, né? Mas meu filho, eu quero que ele passe no vestibular, eu não quero que ele fique jogando joguinho, né? É,
É.
conhecemos, né? Sabemos. Aqui o professor André Guerra, Diversão e Conhecimento, acho que o jogo traduzido pelo RoleSimpósio, o Caminho Azul, também tem a possibilidade de debate de temas sensíveis. Sim, sim. A diferença é que o Caminho Azul, ele é
É
um jogo menor.
fantasioso.
Ele é,
E ele
né?
é
Ele é
E eu diria que ele é fantasioso também, né? Assim, no sentido,
também,
ele criou
também.
uma civilização que não existe, é, até eu fiz uma atividade que envolvia refugiados para turma de 4º ano, crianças de 9 anos de idade, assim, né? E eu fiquei preocupado, assim, com como eu ia trazer o tema, principalmente porque tinham alunos que eu até investiguei, mas eu não consegui saber direito se eram refugiados ou não, se tinham, mas eu fiquei com muito medo de trazer o assunto e não dar o devido cuidado, assim, né? Então eu criei um cenário fantasioso em que existiriam
Hum,
refugiados de uma cena que não era real, não era, né, para que as crianças pudessem refletir a partir da sua brincadeira, né? E
é.
se eu tivesse lido o artigo da Moyra e da Jéssica Hammer antes, talvez eu tivesse mais ferramentas para lidar com isso.
Hum. Aqui o Lataran, ele deve ter questões mecânicas próprias e punitivas, como medo de perder o personagem, ter uma liberdade para ser um monstro causador de dor. Né? Falando sobre essa questão de criar um jogo polêmico. Então, eu queria falar, no meu Larp, no, 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 que eu fiz, né, para o jogo, confesse, para falar sobre a questão do patriarcado, eu acredito que não, porque o nosso foco é específico, sabe? A ideia de usar as regras, né? A Maria do Carmo ela trouxe que no começo, lá dos anos 2000, o simpósio, a ideia era use o método narrativo, e que hoje a gente está falando use as regras, porque as regras elas te permitem simular uma estrutura social, porque as regras vão limitar condutas, né? Como eu falei, o Stillway Jordan, que o personagem escravizado ele não escolhe o próprio nome, tá? Que é todo esse processo da violência mesmo de desindividualizar o sujeito. Então, por exemplo, quando a gente fala da Inquisição, eu estou mais interessado não no ato da violência contra a mulher, mas na cultura que torna esse ato possível, porque é essa cultura que tem que ser desmanchada. Eu acho que o enfoque está nisso, tá? Então, se você fizer. Por isso que tem uma coisa que eu não gosto, em geral, é jogo de guerra, né? Porque o jogo de guerra é o brincar de matar nazista. Tudo bem, nada contra. Mas o fato principal é que se torna pura e simplesmente essa fantasia de que, olha, você vai lá e você joga o dado, quando você tem uma estrutura social muito maior. Tem um jogo, Dulce et Decorum, é um jogo que fez parte de o Fastaval, que é um festival nórdico de RPG e Larp, de 2011,
O Set
2002,
Decorum
12,
é, o- é, o- é o nome de um
um
livro,
poema.
um
Isso.
suplemento do Rastro de Cthulhu, Trail of Cthulhu. Não sei se tem
É
alguma
uma,
coisa a
é
ver.
uma frase, é uma frase romana que fala que é algo como doce e honroso morrer pela pátria, alguma coisa assim, e coloca os jogadores para jogar na Primeira Guerra Mundial. E o jogo, e você vai revelando cartas, e as cartas eles vão gerando um horror, né? O horror da guerra. E no meio das cenas você tem que ler alguns poemas de alguns, né, poetas clássicos, etc. eu acho que talvez do Yeats, e que aborda essa lógica, né, do sublime, né, durante o jogo. Mas eu
Eu,
acho que é um ponto bem interessante nesse sentido.
tem um jogo de tabuleiro que chama. Que se trata da Segunda Guerra. Eu não lembro. Eu não lembro qual é o nome agora, não vou lembrar. Mas são pessoas que estão. Tu joga com personagens que estão na guerra, né? Só que o objetivo do jogo é tu lidar com as emoções e com o que tá. A sobrevivência dos teus colegas, né? Então o objetivo deixa de ser conquistar terreno, fazer aquilo, mas é garantir a sobrevivência daqueles que estão à sua volta e garantir que eles estejam bem, se sintam bem, né? Eu acho um jogo que lida com essa questão de uma maneira muito mais adequada, assim, né? E eu fiz uma vez uma aventura, era para ensino superior, uma turma de jogos digitais, e eu criei, eles conheciam muito mais de regras, ficava muito mais fácil, assim, né? E era uma turma muito pequena. Eu fiz uma sessão de um jogo de guerra, né? Em que eles eram um destacamento que estava indo avançado, assim, tentando ver terrenos antes do deslocamento do exército, né? E para autorizar a vinda, para determinar. E eles acabavam encontrando um grupo de civis que eram simpatizantes do nazismo, assim, né? E aí eles precisavam lidar com aquelas pessoas, idosos, crianças, adultos que não são militares, né? Só que com essa questão E aí como que eles lidam, o que que eles fazem com essas pessoas, liberam, e aí acabam revelando a posição deles, né? Podendo ou, né, o que que vão fazer, né? Vão escoltar, vão prender, e então foi interessante porque eu propositalmente fiz eles criarem os seus personagens com arma, com a sua, e na hora do evento eles tinham tudo que poderia para poder fazer, e coloquei numa situação em que fez eles pensarem, refletirem sobre essa situação, né? Sobre o que seria melhor fazer.
Aqui a Valquíria Araújo fala, né? Tem que fugir do revisionismo histórico também. Isso é um ponto muito importante mesmo, né? A gente precisa realmente conseguir abordar de uma forma muito muito responsável, né? E aí trazer aqui o comentário da Cristina. Mas a gente pode elaborar algo, principalmente com base na literatura, né? Depende da forma como vamos abordar, tem a ver com o público. Foi uma forma de ver o tema, a gente adapta. Não concordo totalmente, Cristina, por favor, não estou falando para não fazer de forma alguma. O que eu falei faz e testa e vê, e se não der certo, né, na minha live sobre Larp e sociologia, eu cheguei a comentar que a minha ideia inicial eu abandonei porque eu vi, né, no Perdição Troiana, eu tive que mudar uma personagem, porque eu fiz um teste e eu vi que ela estava meio deixada de lado, então eu inventei coisa, né? Eu tenho um LARP chamado Contrato Social, que eu fiz um teste e aí no final eu juntei os jogadores e falei, putz, não, vou mudar isso daqui, a gente vai tentar construir. Então, o trabalho está só começando. Eu acho que a gente vai ficar muito feliz de ver o seu trabalho, né? Pode ter certeza que a gente tem interesse, sim. Fábio, últimos comentários?
Tem um monte de coisa, cara. Não temos tempo. Ainda bem que a vida continua depois do simpósio e a gente pode continuar conversando sobre, né?
Né. Gente, encerramos por aqui, tá? Vamos correr para outra palestra, né? Vocês vão ter um minutinho, ou quase. Tchau, até breve.
Valeu, galera.